First thing is this, like the book that made him famous, the book that made him known all around the world, internationally, like James Brown.
Exactly.
And translated, I know it's in Spanish, it's in German, it's in Russian, it's in Polish. And the second thing that brings us here is the Art of DC Dawn of Superheroes exhibition that we host in EC1, which you can visit. Oh, some of you may have probably visited it, but it can be seen until the 2nd of February 2020. And the third, thank you, and the third cause of this meeting is like our help from the American Embassy, which helped us with the funds and arranging all the problematic ticketing, all the minutiae. And I'm Piotr Komorowski, like the curator, of the Polish edition of this exhibition. Mr. Reedem Tuckerem had. I think you've had fun seeing the exhibition today.
Yeah, it's great.
We're doing like curatorial walkthrough through the exhibition tomorrow at 11. So feel free to come visit, buying the ticket, visiting the exhibition, hearing about the amazing objects on the exhibition. And I always think that's great. That's great when like two people love the same nerddom. Were born or just raised in the same nerddom, and through this book, through the interviews I've read and I've heard with Mr. Tucker, I kind of found a guy thinking similarly, and it's always a positive thing to find like a common voice in nerddom, especially now the segregated nerddom or the fighting nerddom. And the man, the myth, the legend, the man of the hour, Mr. Reedem Tuckerem, question number 1, your nerd origin story.
Whoa. You mean going back to my childhood? Was I an outcast?
No, like how did you get into comic books? What's
Yeah.
your Star Wars, like
Yeah.
the nerd culture, Dungeons and Dragons maybe?
No, Dungeons and Dragons was too far for me. That was another type of nerd. No, I read comics as a kid, probably starting from when I was 10 or 11. But then comic books were back then available everywhere. You know, they were on the newsstands, and you could walk into the drugstore and you could buy them. So they weren't as specialized as they are now. So I could remember just buying comics. You know, when I was 10 or 11, if we were going on a long car trip, we'd buy a couple comics and read them. So that's how I got into them.
So it was like kind of like hush comics. You could be bought by your parents.
Yes,
just
right.
To behave on the back seat.
Yeah, exactly.
Are we there yet?
That's so true. I remember they would put them away, and they were like, "You're not allowed to touch them until the car wheels actually start moving." And then we'd be like, "Oh, okay." And you'd be done by the time you turned out of your driveway. You know, some of them, but. Yeah, so that's what I started reading comics then, and still read them now. I don't really read superhero, DC, and Marvel comics anymore. They're just too kind of far gone for me. But I still read, you know, The Walking Dead and some other independent comics, Image comics. But I don't read DC and Marvel anymore.
Like the early comics that you've read, like the earliest memories of comics.
Well, the first comic I can remember reading was one where if you bought a box of cereal and you dig into the bottom of the box of cereal, there's a coupon in there for a power ring, yeah. And so this was for a Justice League comic, and so you fill it out and then you send away for it and you wait an ungodly amount of time, 2 months or something, and then in the mail came a comic. It was about this big, and it was Wonder Woman. And so that was the first comic I can remember ever having.
Do you remember, was it like a special edition or a one-off story, only available through the serial?
Yeah, it was only available through the serial, because I looked it up online when I started writing the book just to see if I remembered correctly, and so it was only available. It was just a special thing that they, as a promotional item for the serial.
Do you remember the story? Was she like fighting with
I haven't
the cereal monster?
I don't know. I don't think the story had anything to do with cereal, but no. So that was the first one, and then I just read, I loved Batman as a kid and Green Lantern for some reason as a kid.
Interesting choice.
Yeah.
It's not like the first choice you would pick.
No.
When you think of superheroes, you probably go Batman, Superman, or the Trinity, maybe Wonder Woman.
Yes.
Thinking of Green Lantern, that's a bold move.
He had a cool costume. I mean, when you're a kid, you're not very picky. That's the reason you choose something, and he had a cool costume.
I know that you just maybe, is green your favorite color? You've had a green shirt.
That could be. Yeah, that's right. That could be. Maybe that's what it is. It's deep inside of me.
So, is this love of comic books from the childhood that brought you to the idea of writing about Marvel and DC?
Somewhat, yeah, because I don't know if it was the same here, but I remember as kids, this was probably when I was growing up in the 1980s, kids would argue on the playground about, which company is better. Marvel's superheroes are better, DC superheroes are better. They would have long conversations about stupid stuff like, could Superman beat up the Hulk? Answer, yes, he absolutely could. So it was all those conversations I can remember where, kids were kind of divide themselves on that Marvel or DC with those companies. And then around 2014, when the movies came into play, DC announced that they were going to release their Batman vs. Superman movie the same day as Marvel was going to release Captain America's Civil War. And when that news came out, I just remember, especially online, people took sides again, just like when I was a kid. Marvel is going to kill DC, DC is going to kill Marvel, and that whole argument just kind of erupted online in magazines and in newspapers. And so that just demonstrated to me that divide was still as passionate as when I was 7 years old. And so it seemed like
do you remember taking notes or taking points in your childhood, like DC?
Yeah,
they're winning, and you found like your notes from childhood.
I wish I should have taken better notes. No, I didn't. But I still remember those conversations those kids had, so that movie, when those movies were announced, that's what really gave me the idea to look into the rivalry between Marvel and DC. And
it's like one of the most iconic rivalries in the pop culture or in culture. It's like Coke or Pepsi.
Exactly. Yeah.
Star Wars, Star Trek, sometimes Lords of the Ring.
Right.
Into that.
Right.
Microsoft and Apple. It's like one of the dichotomies of contemporary culture.
Right. It's true. And it seemed, I think it was a good idea because it seemed like such an obvious idea that somebody should have written a book about it before. And then I looked and no one had. So
that's crazy.
That is crazy.
I would think that someone thought of that because it's an amazing, everybody wants to read that.
It's an obvious idea.
Maybe now everyone, because we kind of live in that great culture in which nerddom and comic books are, it's not bad to read comics. We are not ashamed. We are not bullied by loving the thing that made us nerds. And
it's true. I know, and
it's a good time to be a nerd.
Yeah, and I try to explain to people that are younger, in their teens and 20s that read comic books, how marginalized comic books used to be, how outside of pop culture they used to be, and how, like you said, sometimes you were ashamed to read comic books, in the 70s and 80s, and people looked down on them. They thought they were dumb. They thought they were for kids. And now, the movies are everywhere. They're on TV, and even comic book stores have changed since I was a kid. The comic book stores in my town growing up were always dark and dirty, and no one wanted to go in them.
That's one of the first things you...
Yeah.
The first comic book store you went to is like a shed. Almost.
Yeah, it really was. It was honestly a third the size of this room, and they had boxes piled up everywhere. No one could find anything, and it was a very specialized kind of thing.
Clerk which could tell you...
That's right.
With his eyes closed, what should you read and what shouldn't you
Exactly.
read. And he won't serve you this one because no.
Yeah, it's true.
You don't want this.
But from that to now, at least in America, in New York, where I live, you walk into the comic store and it's beautiful. It looks like a coffee shop. They have wooden chairs. They might even serve coffee. They have beautiful shelves. The books are displayed beautifully. It's just an accepted part of the neighborhood. You know, it's not on the fringes of it's not on the bad part of town. It's changed so much in my lifetime.
Do you sometimes look in the past and think, oh, I would like to visit that shop from 20 years ago? I know that you probably buy some issues that would be worth more.
Yes, that's true. You would know what to buy. No, I don't. It seems much more open now, especially, again, I only talk about America because that's all I know, but when I was growing up, no women read comics, mostly, and when you go to the stores, almost all guys. It was not a very welcoming place, and now when I walk in...
The patriarchy was strong.
Yes, exactly. And when I go to comic conventions, there's a New York Comic Con every year I go to, and it's at least half women. So it feels much more open and mainstream now than it did when I was a child. So no, I don't want to go back to those days. I much prefer it now.
Going back to the book, I wanted to ask you some questions about the process. How was the process? How much was it interviewing people? How much? I kind of see you, if anyone saw the movie Zodiac, when they try to figure out, because was it also kind of like this, like in the corporate archives of Warner and DC, stacks of documents, microfilms with old newspapers and checking?
I wish. No, I wish they would let me into those corporate archives. DC and Marvel didn't want to have anything to do with the book. They did not help me at all. I asked, and they said, "We'll get back to you. We'll get back to you. We'll get back to you."
So you have to find like the artist.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to get information other ways. I think Marvel and DC don't officially really acknowledge that there's a rivalry, and they don't like to promote that, and so they did not help me and did not want the book to come out for some reason, although I don't think it reflects that badly on them. Yeah.
They weren't like, they're like, please don't, if you publish this book, something bad will happen to you.
No, they never said that. That would have been cool. That would have been a good story. But no, so it's mostly talking to people who worked at the companies, talking to artists, and yeah, going back and reading old newspaper articles or magazines. Back in the 70s and the 80s, there were a lot of magazines published about the comic book business, the Comics Journal, Comic Scene. I don't know if you ever had those. It was just news and interviews about, yeah, exactly. So those are long out of print. I mean, those probably went out of business in the 80s, but I just go on eBay and buy a whole bunch of those.
Like you have the whole chronicle of the...
Yeah. So I'll give them to you if you come to my house, or they're in my garage. You don't want them. So I did that. You can look in newspapers online now. There's tons of historical newspapers. There's also some interesting things. Columbia University in New York, they have one of the few libraries that treats comic books like, historical art. And so they have some curators there who try to build up the collection of comics history, and one of the things they have is Chris Claremont, who famously wrote the X-Men for many years. They have his papers, so I went there and looked through his papers. It's shoeboxes, basically 10 of them, with all his notes that he took when he was working on the X-Men, sample or spec scripts he wrote of the X-Men movie in the early 80s before anything could be made. Outlines, scripts, all sorts of personal notebooks that he wrote.
It's an exhibition waiting to happen.
Yeah, it really is. It's not very visually interesting because it's just a lot of like words on paper, but it was fascinating to read through some of his notes and.
Because you begin to know what the guy was thinking. His process.
Yeah.
In creating some of the art. That's amazing.
Yeah. So I looked through those, and there were a few things that helped me there. So yeah, it was you just do all that work and then interview people, and then you have a book at the end.
What are the names, the big names you've interviewed?
For the book?
Yeah.
Neil Adams was a big one. If people don't know, he's probably the most famous artist from the 60s, drew a lot of DC stuff. Paul Levitz, who was...
He made Batman cool again.
He made Batman cool again, yeah, exactly.
There's Neil Adams. He made Batman. That's cool again.
Yes.
That's like one of the iconic Batmans.
classic.
Yeah, and it's on the exhibition. So.
Yeah. Jerry Conway, who I love, just people like that. Mostly I tried to get people who had worked at both companies and who had worked as far back as I could get them. And they, a lot of those people aren't alive anymore. So it was difficult to find people who, Jerry Conway worked at DC in the late 60s. Neil Adams worked at DC in the late 60s. Most of those people are gone. Oh, I talked to Stan Lee, Frank Miller, all sorts of people.
How is Stan Lee in real life? How was Stan Lee in real life?
Just like you see him on TV. He's very enthusiastic.
He's kind of a larger-than-life character.
He is, yeah. And so even when you're talking to him one-on-one or on the phone, he still puts on that personality, which is great. It's entertaining, but honestly, for a journalist, it doesn't help you at all. And also, he's told the same stories the same way for 30 or 40 years, and I don't even think he knows what's true anymore.
So maybe it's that's the idea. You're fishing for the inadequacies. You've said something different in the interview from 1997.
It could be, yeah, maybe. But, I did interview him because he was important, but he didn't give me that much useful stuff because it's just the same stories he's told. So it's like, well, and then other people told me, well, that's not exactly the way it happened. So I think his memory, as he said, is bad, and he may not remember exactly what happened back then. But he's fun, he's entertaining. I love the guy, but
that's one of the other thing I wanted to ask. How was the process of kind of elimination, of checking the facts, of rooting out the prejudice, all the bad words, all the bad blood that was spilled between the companies and between the artists. It was probably hard to navigate, hard to find the truth. And there is so much money, art, and friendship and hateful at stake.
It's true. It's a really good point. And another thing I discovered is, back in the 50s, the 40s, 50s, and 60s, comic books were considered trash. Nobody ever thought, we'd be watching movies that this page would be worth, $200,000 or whatever it is. Nobody ever envisioned that. And so they were doing this as a job. Working in comic books was not a prestigious job. You only worked in comic books if you couldn't work in, Hollywood or in advertising. And so the people who fell down to that rung in comic books never thought anything would amount to anything. And so when they create a character, in the 50s or 60s, they just dashed it off, they got the check, and then they went home. And so their memories of those events were not very solid. And so, you ask Stan Lee what happened, with Spider-Man, or you ask Jack Kirby what happened with Spider-Man, they'll give you all these different answers because, of course, they didn't take any notes at the time because they never thought they would talk about it again.
It was just like another day at the office for them.
Exactly. And as long as the check cleared and they got their money, they were fine with that, and until they could move on to something that was more prestigious of a job. And so when you start digging into the history of some of these characters or things that went on at the company, you would get a lot of different versions. One person would remember it this way or one person would remember it that way. And so it is hard because a lot of times, Marvel was a very small company back in the 60s. Only a handful of people worked in the office. And so there was nobody else that you could ask what happened.
One time it was only Stan Lee.
It was only Stan Lee, right, at one point, a full-time employee. And so that made it very difficult. And there was the grudges, you say, that's true, that there were a lot of people who did not like each other, and yet they were working together. And so if they were still alive, you'd talk to one of them, and they would give you a story that made them the hero of it. And then you talk to the other person, and they would minimize the other person's contribution, and they would be the hero of the story. I did more on that character. This guy came in, and he didn't do anything. And so that did make it difficult. All those behind-the-scenes feuds that these people have from who knows what, working together for so many years.
Yeah, plus there's this, the artist's attitude, the ego, which sometimes doesn't help.
Yeah.
Sometimes comes in the way between, a good partnership.
That's right.
Between, a screenwriter and then the artist. Sometimes it's not as smooth
Right.
as one would like it to be.
Right.
The last question in the intro part, when we were talking about the process, how long did it take you to gather the material and write it, finish it, and when you just made the last comma and said going zen and it's complete?
Well, only about a year, a little over a year. I maybe started gathering information, reading for myself, maybe a year before that, so maybe 2 years in total. But from I signed the contract to write the book to I turn it in, only a year, because in America they wanted to release the book in October at the New York Comic Con, so they had that deadline, and then also a new Iron Man movie was coming out, and all these, so they wanted to have that when they released the book. So they told me you have to turn this in by a certain date. So that's why I only had a year, which is, if you ever write a book, that's not enough time. It was not enough time.
Ever think of going back to it and adding like the second tome or other thoughts or expanding something? Or just like
I mean,
closed?
It is what it is. It's
okay.
My day job is a journalist, so I work in newspapers, and newspapers, the deadlines are even tighter. So you get what you can get, you write it as well as you can, and then it's gone. So there's you can't be precious about your work, I guess, and love it so much.
Well, I thought that maybe it's like still polishing it to be like the perfect gem.
No.
And never finishing it and never letting the world know what you did.
No, I don't want that. That's like, George Lucas with Star Wars. He keeps revisiting Star Wars over and over again. It's just like, I don't think it's making it better, so I just, it is what it is, and it's probably making it worse. So, yeah. So I just leave it as it is, and imperfect as it is, there it is.
You say it's perfect, you might say it's imperfect, but it's still pretty good.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it.
And now let's start the slugfest, and let's start the history. Little does anyone know, both of the companies started probably at the same time in the 1930s.
Yeah, which I guess I knew that, but I was kind of surprised that Marvel is as old, because I think of DC as kind of the old company in the business.
Granddaddy.
The granddaddy, exactly. But Marvel is almost as old. Marvel was founded in 1939, DC a few years before that. So both of the companies started right around the same time.
But they're starting like from two different levels. Like 1938 Discovery is a little later.
Yeah.
You're gonna see that.
Yeah.
Because it's from the wartime. But like 1938 revolutionized the medium because of this dude.
Right.
The boy in blue.
Right.
And like everybody wanted to jump on the bandwagon.
Right, including Marvel. So that's how Marvel got their start, which that kind of comes up over and over again in the war between Marvel and DC, is that they're competitors, but they also influence each other. And without the other company, one company wouldn't exist without the other one, or wouldn't exist in the same way. And so Marvel literally got its start because Superman was so popular and they wanted to copy Superman. So, they put out Marvel Comics #1, which had two superheroes in it, the Human Torch and the Submariner. And that was their first comic. And they were just trying to make money on a fad. And they saw superheroes as a fad, and so they jumped on.
What's like the secret ingredient that made Superman click and it made him like the world's biggest superhero? What do you think? And Marvel kind of failed. They had like the Submariner is the iconic character now, but it had to be revamped later, just like Human Torch.
No, for sure. I don't know if there was something about Superman or there was something about superheroes, because almost all the superheroes released at that time sold pretty well. The Submariner and the Human Torch, they're not so popular nowadays, but back then when they debuted, they sold a lot of copies for Marvel. And then Captain America came along and sold, I think, 1 million copies the first issue, just in America. So for whatever reason, people were looking for superheroes. I don't know. I'm not smart enough to tell you why. It may have something to do with the war or feeling powerless, or at the time, I don't know. But there was something about a costume character with powers that people really jumped onto.
people always say that Superman was like the embodiment of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, like the new opening of the policy and a symbol of hope in society after the crisis, the economic crisis. And even the first like stories of Superman, he's not fighting to save the planet.
Right.
He's fighting like a falsely accused woman,
Right.
Helping up an interpreter to save his business. So it's like the small things which were supposed to probably bring hope to the.
That may be, yeah, right. It's funny to, as you say, to read those early Superman stories and how different they are from now, and how limited his powers were. You know, he couldn't fly.
Exactly.
He could only jump. And so over the years, they have ramped him up. So now, you know, he's almost a god. He's invulnerable. But yeah, it is funny to read those early stories where he's like a progressive hero, you know, dealing out justice.
And you can see like the story of how a character that's now worth millions of dollars became a creation of people who died, maybe not in poverty, but they didn't get their due because Siegel and Schuster weren't treated as good as by DC corporation. No,
DC paid them $130 for the first Superman story, and then the rights to Superman forever, and they got paid, you know, more money over the years. They certainly got paid to, you know, write and draw the pages, and they, a couple times during the 60s and the 50s, they sued DC to try to get more money, and sometimes they would win a little more money, but until the 70s when the movie came out, they were getting hardly anything from Superman. Meanwhile, DC and Warner Brothers were making billions of dollars, and so they had to create a public campaign to try to get them some money, and they were old age, and Joe Shuster was almost blind, and he was living on his brother's floor in a terrible apartment in New York, and I think one time he was homeless. He was sleeping on a park bench. And so DC, after that, paid them a little bit of money, I think $25,000 a year.
It was like a yearly pension. Right?
Yeah, they got a pension. I think their medical benefits were covered, but they got, you know, not even a fraction of what the character was worth, even in 1 year. And that, you know, that's the case with a lot of comic book creators. Is, you know, they don't make any money off their creations, really.
I talked with Reed today about like the Polish inspirations for Superman, because in the 1920s there was this strong man called Zisher Breitbart, born in Stryków, lived in Stryków. He was a smith there, and apparently he made a tourney around the world, and in 1923 he was doing a tour around the US, and he came to Cleveland, in the city where young Siegel and Schuster lived, and he performed there. And the funny thing is that he was called the Superman of the ages, or the Superman of his times, even when there's the telegraph address for him, like his office in New York, which said New York, Zisher Breitbart, New York Superman. And this is like totally nerdy because it's like the fitness program of the 1920s, when you could subscribe, send your dimensions to him, he would give you advice on work on your chest or something like this, work on your biceps. And it's double nerdy because it's Superman of New York and it's Gotham Bank, so it's both Metropolis and Gotham City. So this is an amazing piece. This is Mr. Breitbart.
One thing I love though is a strong man in the 1920s is like half the size of the guy who plays Superman nowadays. You know, Henry Cavill is probably twice the size of that guy. It's amazing. You know, he just looks like me.
Yeah.
Except I couldn't do
it. The sad thing is that with all his like incredible body and incredible body strength, he also died. His kryptonite was a rusty nail. He got cut by a rusty nail in one of his performances. There was some infection, and he died in 1922 from the infection.
Really?
So with all the bodily strength, just a small nail, rusty nail, brought this Superman down.
Sad.
Yeah, it's a sad story of a champion of a society, because he was always championing like the Jewish cause, seeing the downtrodden part of society, trying to lift them up, seeing, comparing himself to Samson and bringing like the fighting against prejudice. Like he always said, if there are like someone has problems with Jews, bring them to me. So, and yeah, that's the story of Superman. And this is the Action comic cover, the original art that's presented on the exhibition. It's one of the first.
Yeah.
We were talking about like it's amazing, you can see it in the artwork, how it was made. Because they've established a font, they established a logo, and they just copied it, cut it out, and make like a, how do you call it? A patchwork of logotypes, of names, and then drew around it.
Yeah.
Drew around it and cut with the. It's amazing how you see the process, and the exhibition allows you to see the process of making art.
I love this cover too because, you know, one of the differences between Marvel and DC is that Marvel takes place supposedly in the real world. You know, the heroes live in New York City. Whoever's president of the United States is president of the Marvel universe, whereas DC is much more fantasy-based. You know, they live in Gotham, Metropolis. And
which is still New York.
Which is still New York, exactly, both of them. But, you know, Marvel took on some current events, you know, the Vietnam War and those sorts of things, whereas DC, for the most part, tried to stay away from all that because their stuff was for kids. But this is kind of one of the few times where, the current events kind of invaded the comics, and I kind of love that.
But at the same time, like Superman never fought in the war because the war would be like Watchmen in Vietnam War, yeah.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, it would be over in 5 seconds.
Day, yeah.
Yeah, in 1940, a magazine, an American magazine, asked Siegel and Schuster to draw a 2-page comic strip about how Superman would win World War II, and so it's in 2 pages. He does exactly that. He flies over. He takes all the guns, he destroys all the tanks, he catches Hitler, and then that's it. And the Nazis read that story, and they got so mad about it that they published an essay against Superman in their propaganda magazine in Germany. Okay. So even the Nazis knew about Superman in 1940. So I guess this is their rebuttal.
So it's not like... they believed in the Ubermensch, but not this.
right, because Jewish creators and all. I guess they.
And yeah, there's that another piece of truly American art with the Superman number 14. It's like the third piece that's on the exhibition. I've told Reed that this is the most expensive piece on the exhibition. That's
wow.
When you think about comic book art. This really reaches the level of art prices because it's like almost $800,000 in a frame. So you could buy some good art with that, or you could buy this amazing art with that.
Right, and we were talking back in the days they would throw it away. They wouldn't even save it because they didn't think it was worth.
Lots of the original covers are missing. You cannot find the original for. Most of the early Superman comic books because no one cared about it.
No.
It was like disposable.
Yeah. Or they would give them out. Have you heard those stories that when kids would tour a DC office in the 60s, DC offered a tour 1 day a week, and at the end of the tour, the editor would just go into the closet and he would give them pages of original art from comics just for free.
Every week I would be there.
Yeah, it was
right. Like wearing binoculars with a mustache. Haven't you heard before? No, it's my first time.
And you would not be working if you had done that.
Yeah, probably.
You would be wealthy.
The 1939. So it's Batman. It's like the kind of the opposite in the spectrum of superheroes because he's just a man.
Yeah.
And there's this. Oh yeah, we were talking about this.
Oh yeah.
Do you want to talk about the character, the people who created Batman? Once again, kind of.
Yeah. Well, a little bit. Yeah. Can you go back to the previous? Well, I think most people probably know Batman was created in 1939 by Bob Kane, but probably not really by Bob Kane. Bob Kane was an artist, and he's the one who sold Batman to DC Comics. He's the one who signed the contract, but within his contract, it's stipulated that he would always have to be credited as the creator of Batman and the artist on comic books that he didn't even draw. I think he did happen to draw this one, as you see his signature, but so from, I think after 1943, he didn't draw Batman anymore. So he hired people within his studio, 3 or 4 different artists, to draw Batman, and then they'd just sign his name to it, and he would collect the money. So he, yeah.
It's a good place to be in.
Yeah, it's great, but I guess the story I heard was his father was an accountant, and so his father went with him to sign the contract with DC, and so he's one of the few artists back in those days that actually made a decent deal, whereas the others didn't know what they were doing, so they would sign any piece of paper. He negotiated more for the rights of Batman, and so he controlled the art of Batman until, I think, 1967, and they got so tired of his art and him controlling it, and it still looked like this in 1967, they paid him, I think it was $50,000 a year for 20 years just to go away so they could hire new artists.
Smart move.
A smart move, yeah, but I mean, it's funny, he was an artist and his weakness was he couldn't draw. So he had to hire these other people. And but, you know, Batman, depending on how, I don't know how much he probably contributed. He probably contributed some of it, but you know, he worked with other people, mainly Bill Finger, a writer, and it was those other people who came up with what we think of as Batman. So, you know, he has a dark costume. He goes out at night. Yeah. He's a detective. He was a boy whose parents were murdered in an alley. All that comes from Bill Finger.
He's like gadgets.
Exactly. So none of that is Bob Kane. That was all Bill Finger. So these other people added things to Batman that are now a huge part of what Batman is and never really got credit for it. So I guess that's the theme of this.
Once again, this part, this is like the original, the concept of the original Joker card and the original concept for the character, how the character should be depicted, and it was created by Jerry Robinson. It's also on display, and the funny thing is that there's a documentary or there's an interview in which the guys mentioned a fight over who came up with this.
Right.
So of course Bob Kane says he thought of all of it.
Yeah.
Diminishes the role of Bill Finger or Jerry Robinson. So it's hard to find the truth.
Right.
We know that this is the work of Jerry Robinson.
Right.
He supposedly came into the studio and said, "Hey, I got the idea for a card that would be a sign of the character, and I would go this direction with the way he looks."
Right.
So there's another artist that's was kind of left behind by in the early years. You've looked at this. Speaking about the quality of the comics or the really not so polite times, the quiet or Peppa Spank, like that.
Yeah, it was just a different time where Batman is going to spank Catwoman. I mean, you know, there was a lot of that with the Wonder Woman comics too in the 1940s, where almost every issue Wonder Woman got tied up by the villain and got spanked. Yes, so I don't know.
Damsel in distress.
Yeah, exactly. So something was going on there. But
your book you're writing.
I love this.
It's fine because when you think of creating a movie universe or a comic book universe, you don't think that DC is doing a great job in establishing a single universe, but they were like the first publisher to create it. That they were the first to acknowledge that the characters from their comic books exist in the same universe.
Yeah. Flash
could meet Green Lantern. Like the whole Justice Society of America could be established.
Yeah.
I repeat myself, but how the mighty have fallen when you've created the idea of the universe.
Yeah.
And now you're being outdone by Marvel.
Definitely, but still, I think this is a funny image, and there's a similar image on the cover, because if you can imagine being a kid and reading about these heroes separately, and then somebody tells you the idea that they're all going to be in one comic book on the same team, you would think, holy crap, you know, and your mind would be blown, and then you get the comic book, and then you open it up, and this is what you get. You know, they're having a meeting about the budget or something. It's just, they're all sitting around a table. It's just not very exciting.
You really set your expectations really high.
Yes.
And then you get like pep talks about how should we perform, or like it's strange once again to say what became of comics, or what was expected of them to become, and how DC kind of failed in storytelling in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, well, again, it's different now because if you read comics, they're very sophisticated, they're very smart. Even DC and Marvel comics, they're aimed at adults, middle-aged people. That's probably, at least in America, the people who read comics the most are men in their 30s and 40s. And so the material has gotten much smarter over the years, whereas back in the 40s and 50s, people who were reading DC Comics were probably 8, 9, 10-year-olds. And so DC, that was their target audience. And DC always had the idea that people would age out of comic books. They would read them for 3 or 4 years, and then they would move on when they got too old. And so much so that DC would sometimes repeat stories every 3 or 4 years because they figured that somebody who was reading comics 4 years ago wasn't still reading comics, and so they could present the same story over and over again. They just got lazy. Now we know, like people still read comics into their 30s and 40s from childhood, but they never thought that was going to happen, and so.
And then came 1961, and someone told them how to write comics.
Yeah, so then Marvel comes along, and they do things completely differently. Stan Lee famously, his wife told him, "Why don't you just write a comic book that you would want to read?" And so he and Jack Kirby put together the Fantastic Four in 1961, and it was aimed at a little bit of an older audience, maybe teenagers and college students, still I guess kids, but a little bit of an older audience than was reading DC, and it was completely different take on the superheroes, and people who were reading comics back then talked about finding that issue of Fantastic Four, those early Marvel comics, and reading them and just seeing something completely new, and also never being able to go back to DC Comics because DC Comics at that time, after reading Marvel, seemed like it was just kid stuff.
Yeah, those comics didn't treat you as an adult.
Right. Well, because they were not made for adults.
Exactly.
They were made for 8-year-olds.
So it took Marvel 11 years to start from almost from the bottom.
Yeah.
To become the #1 player when it comes to sales.
Only 11 years. It is crazy. It's crazy. Yeah, right. 1972, they finally overtook DC in sales.
And you're writing about how the corporate DC couldn't get a grip of what's going on.
Right. Yeah, that was their biggest flaw, was DC was so successful for so long, mainly because of Superman. They didn't take the other companies seriously, especially Marvel, which was, a nothing company, especially in the 50s. Marvel almost went out of business in 1957. They were down to 1 employee. They didn't publish anything that we would remember now. It was mostly war comics, Western comics, romance comics. There were not many superhero comics that they were publishing, so until 1961. And so, so DC never thought Marvel was going to be a threat. And then they started seeing the sales data of Marvel. Marvel was picking up. And they were kind of baffled by why anyone would want to read Marvel. And so these old guys and the executives at DC would hold these meetings where they would get a stack of Marvel comics or some Marvel art, and they would all flip through them.
Trying to find the magic.
Trying to find what the magic was, and they didn't understand. But, yeah, well...
You were writing about,
right.
They wanted to copy, they thought, oh my god, the Marvel comics have lots of dialogue on the covers. Copying this.
Yes, exactly.
You get this thing.
Right. But also this one's interesting because if you see a Marvel comic, especially in the 60s, most were done by Jack Kirby, the covers, and so it's a big action scene. The Silver Surfer is about to punch Thor, or the Hulk is destroying something. It's very in your face, it's very exciting. They have no questions about what's going on. Whereas DC, their covers tended to be something like this. I only chose this because this is in the exhibit, the original, but yeah, there you go. You can kind of see what's going on, but they were mostly very static, almost like boring. covers where you have to read all of that dialogue to understand what the conflict is, what is going on there. Whereas Marvel, there's no question. You know exactly what the conflict is somebody's going to punch someone. And here it's like, oh, okay, I counted 65 words. You have to read 65 words to understand why Supergirl is jealous of whoever this person is. That you can understand if you're somebody who reads comics in the 60s and this is what you're used to month after month. And then you see something like Marvel Comics, Fantastic Four #1, where a monster's coming out of the sidewalk and there's a rock creature trying to beat it. What's that?
You instantly want to know more.
Well, exactly.
We are defining.
Right, exactly. Whereas this, it just doesn't. It doesn't grab you. And so DC, in every aspect of their business, they could not understand what they needed to do better or to be more like Marvel to win. And so Marvel just sailed on past them in like you said, in 11 years.
And this is like also the time in which the dirty tricks start to emerge. All the name calling, the buying out the artists.
Right. Yeah, if you read those Marvel comics from the 60s, Stan Lee used to write a column in every Marvel comic, and he just straight up calls people names in there. And his idea was Marvel Comics was not #1 at the time, but he was going to act like they were. And so he was going to be very arrogant in kind of a funny way, and he was going to call DC names, called them Brand Eck, very famously, say that they didn't have good art, say that everyone was reading Marvel, which was more and more true, but DC at the time was still #1. But he was acting like Marvel was #1. And so he's the one who built up that rivalry because he thought it would be good for the business and that it would make his fans love Marvel even more or be more loyal to them. It was kind of correct. So he built almost like a cult around Marvel. He had a fan club, and they made merchandise, they made T-shirts, and they put out a record.
The Attitude Era in wrestling.
Yeah, that's right.
Because the attitude was the thing that sold it.
Totally true, right. Which I think exactly right. And that's one of the reasons I think we love Marvel now is because they do have a personality, whereas DC... especially back then, it's very hard to say what is DC's personality other than it's corporate.
It's always like the dichotomy of the cool kid on the block and the corporation.
Yeah, exactly. Marvel was like, the guy with long hair and a jean jacket smoking a cigarette behind the school, and DC was the guy, in a tie, sorry to say, who's doing well in math class. I mean, that's kind of the difference, and it's much cooler to hang out with Marvel than it is with DC.
Yeah. But at the same time, like the rivalry took on also corporate measures, like raising up the prices, lowering up the prices.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Stealing artists.
Yeah, that's right. There was that. That's how Marvel finally took the lead with DC in 1972. Was supposedly the two companies, the heads got together and talked about they were going to raise the price, which is kind of illegal, but maybe not anyway. So they said they were going to raise the price, to I think from 20 cents to 35 cents or something. And so they both agreed that, in a few months they were going to do it, together. And so DC did it, raised their price, and then Marvel did it a couple months later. But then after only 1 month at the higher price, Marvel, the publisher, double-crossed DC and then lowered his price back down to 20 cents. And so when you're a kid, that 5 cents difference is huge. And so...
Yeah, for $1 you can buy 4 comics or 5 comics.
Exactly. And so kids became even more loyal to Marvel and were picking up more of them. And so that's how Marvel finally overtook DC in sales, is the publisher of Marvel went back and double-crossed DC on a bargain that he had made.
Well, you also write, and that's the story, Jack Kirby switched sides.
Yeah.
One of the pillars of early Marvel, like the 60s Marvel, started drawing for DC.
Yeah.
With the new gods.
That's right. I was trying to think of like what now that would be like. It would be like, Messi or somebody going to the English Premier League or something. But back then, there were very few people comic book readers knew by name, and Jack Kirby was one of the very, very few. Back then, most comic book companies did not give credit to the people who were drawing the stories because, especially DC, their idea was, we don't want people to buy a comic book because Jack Kirby did it. We want people to buy Batman and don't care who did it. So they were very reluctant to put names on. But Jack Kirby was such a star. He was such a big name that people knew him. And so when he decided to switch sides in 1970, it was, I mean, huge, huge news. It was unthinkable that somebody who was so associated with Marvel could then go over to DC. And so he was out in California, I think in 1969, and he had dinner with the head of DC and said he wanted to come over. Marvel had just offered him a new contract that he thought underpaid him by a lot, and he was also tired of Stan Lee taking all the credit for Marvel creations, and so he wanted to come over and do something with DC, and this is the idea that he brought them, The New Gods, which soon to be a movie, apparently.
Yeah, and it's funny because when we were talking in the exhibition with some people from the industry, and about the exhibition, the DC wasn't very happy when establishing the collection for the exhibition. They weren't very keen on taking covers or taking panels from Kirby's work, from The New Gods. It's
right.
This part of heritage that they don't want to show, which is strange because we were talking today about, I don't know if you've read the Mr. Miracle by Tom King.
Yes.
Which
it's
is
good.
An amazing comic book.
Yeah.
It's like really current, great writing, great art.
Yeah.
And it starts with with an invention of Kirby, because Mr. Miracle is like, is the son of the High Father Dark Side and Jack Kirby.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because it's another deficiency of DC is they hired probably the greatest comic book artist maybe of all time, and certainly of that time, who was doing wonderful things at Marvel. They bring him over, and then they don't let him do what made him so great. You know, they tried to rein him in, and so they were, at the time, most people inside DC did not understand these comics, did not like them, did not think they were very good, and they were canceled reasonably quickly. Again, it's because sales or because they didn't like them, no one's quite sure. But
how do you call it? The perfect aspects of the human body that were drawn by the artists of DC.
Right.
Nothing to do with Kirby, because Kirby went crazy. His characters had different fingers.
Right, that's right.
Square fingers with square heads.
Yeah.
And they couldn't get around that because, like, the works of DC artists had to be Michelangelo's works, Leonardo's works.
Right.
Pristine.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. DC was not happy with the way that he drew, which, like you said, it was very blocky, it was kind of grotesque, it wasn't clean, and so they had a real problem, not necessarily with some of these new characters, but with their established characters, like Superman, because they were making a lot of money in merchandise, and Superman always had to look the same way. Yeah. You know, he had to be on model. And so Jack Kirby came along, and his Superman looked like Jack Kirby, and they didn't like that. And so almost every time you see a Superman in a Jack Kirby book, somebody else has come back behind him and redrawn his face, including here. So he drew this all, but he didn't draw Superman's face. So the inker came back and drew Superman's face on model, which I find kind of crazy.
It's tough to, from our perspective, to think that you could make some, like, you don't, you think about, you know, the lady who conserved the painting of Jesus somewhere in Spain.
Yes.
Is it a bad thing?
Yeah.
It's like, try to make a Kirby better.
Yeah.
No.
I know.
If I was given, like, a great painting to conserve, no one would give it to me.
No.
Why would someone make Kirby better? No.
Yeah, I don't know, but they did it on almost all of his work. Yeah, including that one.
Crazy.
Yeah, it is.
We were sticking around this is Bill Sienkiewicz's Superman pinup. We were kind of doing Where's Wally, searching all of the characters.
Yeah.
And do you remember this one? Do you remember this one? Yeah, probably one of the best pieces in the exhibition.
Yeah, it's great. I love this though, but this is from 1986?
Something like this.
So you can see how the attitude has shifted a little bit since 1970 from Jack Kirby, where they're redrawing Superman's face, to this, which is pretty abstract.
Yeah, like the 80s changed a lot.
Yeah. And so DC was starting to loosen the reins a little bit starting in the early 1980s, in part because they were getting killed by Marvel and they had to do something different. So, guys like Sienkiewicz came along, and so they were allowing things that they would not necessarily allow in the years before. Including this is kind of a beautiful abstract Superman.
Oh.
Hey.
Probably, I want most of you probably already read it, so maybe won't spoil it so much. So maybe let's leave the comic book world alone and just make a trip to the movie world.
Yeah.
1978, the first movie that made people believe a man can fly.
Yeah.
As was shown and written on the poster. It didn't have such an effect on like comic book sales, right?
It didn't. That has never happened. Well, actually, sorry, it did happen with Batman, the TV series in America, the 1966 TV series. Batman sales absolutely soared on that. But after that, no. And no one is sure why. And then, when this movie came out, DC was not doing well at all. Their comics were not selling. And so everyone was hoping that when this movie came out, it would give a real boost to the industry and to DC, and then it never happened.
DC wasn't doing well, but Warner Bros. Was. So Warner Bros. Had to pay the costs for the
right
for the kids at DC.
That's exactly right.
Parents had to step in.
Yeah. Why? Yeah.
It's really hard. Yeah, the costume is on display.
Yeah.
Even now, like I don't think the movies have so much of an influence on sales.
They don't. No, they do not. And I think because
I understand that that's not a good movie.
Yeah.
It shouldn't cause a large amount of comic books to be bought. Although you can still buy the Dark Knight from Miller's, which the costume hails from. But it's still amazing to me that kind of movies are made just to keep the license.
Yeah.
Like they're kind of not tied to the source material in that way that it influences sales. It's just a product which you have to make a movie to keep the license for. You can cash in for a couple of years.
Well, that happens occasionally, especially DC. Well, I mean Marvel now too. DC is since '67 has been owned by a big corporation whose main business is not comic books. And in fact, comic books is one small part of their business. And so every once in a while, the people who own the company will come along and look at DC Comics and look at how much money they're making or how much money they're losing and start asking questions, why are we still doing this? And so in the 70s, those people almost closed down DC Comics and they were going to stop producing all new titles and just reprint old Batman comics or old Superman comics. And the publisher, Jeanette Kahn, told the people at Warner Brothers, don't do this because we have all these people sitting at DC Comics and they're creating new characters that can be exploited for, pajamas, TV shows, movies. They're creating new stories about Superman and Batman. Those things are valuable. It's almost like research and development for things down the line that will pay off. I think people who read comic books don't like to think of it that way, that it's just feeding into the movies, but that, I think, is what's keeping comic books alive now and what kept comic books alive in the 1970s.
Just the R&D lab for the comic
movie
industry.
That's it, yeah. They didn't know it back then because there weren't that many successful movies, but that was her argument, and I think she's right. I think, yeah.
Is it like the only way out of this conundrum? And
what's that?
Just being R&D developed,
I think so. I don't know.
Will they ever make a good DC movie? I know there's the Joker movie, which everyone says it's a good movie.
Yeah.
But it can be a generic movie that has the tie-ins to the world of DC.
Yeah.
But will we ever see a cultural phenomenon as a DC movie?
Yeah, I'm sure we will.
When asked about who's the state of the war,
Yeah.
You don't give like a direct answer. But in the movieverse, Marvel's kind of winning.
Yeah, Marvel's winning for sure. I mean, they're making more money. They're more popular. Well, maybe. I don't know. In America, certainly The Flash and...
If you compare like the CW verse, where the Flash, the Arrow, now Batwoman.
Yeah.
But there's still Daredevil from Netflix, which was amazing. Jessica Jones, which we saw here.
Yeah.
Luke Cage. Iron Fist, not so much. But
No.
hey,
Right. I don't know. I think DC does do better in TV than they do in movies. At least those characters in the TV show of The Flash and Legends of Tomorrow and Green Arrow, those characters, at least to me, are closer to the characters I know from the comic books.
Yeah.
They're presenting a version of the character that I myself would like to watch, whereas, you know, Superman killing someone and all this darkness and the stuff from Superman versus Batman, that's not the version of the characters that I personally want to see. So I would say DC is doing okay in TV, and I mean, who knows? They reboot Batman and Superman every 5 or 6 years, and so I'm sure when there's
somewhere down the line there will be a decent one.
There will be, exactly. I mean, really, that's cynical to say, but that's absolutely true. Those characters are so popular and so valuable and so well known that they're going to keep remaking them, and one time somebody will hit on something. Okay. I mean, the Christopher Nolan Batman, the first two I thought were pretty good, and so that's been 10, 15 years? So
it's crazy how time flies.
Yeah.
It's crazy how much Batman has changed over the years. So.
Yeah. So I don't know, can you wait another 10 years for a good one?
Let's not like lie to ourselves. I will watch it.
Yeah, of course. That's right.
I might be grumpy and I say, "Nah, my Batman."
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll pay the ticket. I'll buy popcorn. I'll buy Coke.
Me too.